Part 34. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 331. He kidnapped Li Xiaolu and then set up a trap to trick Chen Tao into entering the trap just to see Chen Tao kiss Li Xiaolu. Isn't this too childish? Is it that simple? Although Chen Tao didn't think it would be that simple, Chen Tao couldn't change anything now. Chen Tao didn't know who the owner of that voice was, but Chen Tao knew that the technology possessed by the owner of that voice was unimaginable. If you want to save Li Xiaolu's life, you can only do what that person said. Chen Tao's eyes fell on Li Xiaolu beside him. Li Xiaolu was slightly startled. She looked at Chen Tao with her moving eyes, which had a hint of luster. Li Xiaolu's fair cheeks had two blushes, and she said, "Do you really want to do this?" Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Li Xiaolu, at Li Xiaolu's little girlish face, and at her red cheeks. Chen Tao was stunned. Simple. What is the relationship between Chen Tao and Li Xiaolu? In Chen Tao's view, Li Xiaolu is like his sister. Although she is not related by blood, because she is younger than Chen Tao treats her like his own sister. Chen Tao loves Li Xiaolu very much. But now if I kiss Li Xiaolu, what does that mean? For a moment, Chen Tao didn't know how to answer Li Xiaolu. If you don't do it, it means giving up Li Xiaolu's life. But if you do it, how will Chen Tao and Li Xiaolu get along in the past? Looking at Li Xiaolu's red face, Chen Tao hesitated. Just like this, you can't do it? Haha, it seems that you are playing tricks on me. Do you plan to die together? A cold and neutral voice slowly sounded. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao's heart suddenly condensed. He frowned slightly. Chen Tao. Li Xiaolu suddenly said, and she looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao was slightly startled and looked at Li Xiaolu. Li Xiaolu stood there slim and graceful. She looked at Chen Tao with her moving eyes. Do you think Xiaolu is not good? There was a hint of uneasiness and nervousness in her eyes. Chen Tao was stunned for a moment and said, "What?" Li Xiaolu raised her face, looked at Chen Tao with her steamy eyes, and said, "If you think Xiaolu is good, why are you so hesitant? If you replace me with Betty, then kissing her on the lips wouldn't be very good. A normal thing." I know. Li Xiaolu lowered her head and said with some inferiority complex, "My figure is not as good as Sister Ziking's, and I am not as cute as Betty. Compared with those from outside the earth, Sister Lin and others, I am even less beautiful." Debbie. Chen Tao was stunned. He looked at the girl with low self-esteem in front of him, his heart beating slightly. Li Xiaolu looked at Chen Tao, her big eyes filled with blurry water vapor, and said, "But, Chen Tao, I like you. In fact, I fell in love with you from the first moment I saw you. Later, you were very gentle to me, and I fell in love with you without even realizing it." She slowly lowered her head and said softly, "I actually don't like men who are philandering, but there are some things that cannot be controlled rationally." She said, "I am also very confused and I don't know what to do." Seeing Li Xiaolu's demeanor, Chen Tao was silent for a moment. Was that what she thought? In Chen Tao's opinion, Li Xiaolu has always been a relatively silent and passive girl. During this period of time with Li Xiaolu, she had never been that fond of talking. It turned out that this was what she was thinking about. So, what should we do? Chen Tao looked at Li Xiaolu, and he involuntarily raised his hand and reached for her little face. Li Xiaolu was slightly startled. A big hand pinched Li Xiaolu's chin and raised her face. Li Xiaolu was stunned for a moment. She looked at Chen Tao with her big clear eyes, a trace of confusion in her eyes. Chen Tao looked at his moving eyes, and his gaze slowly fell on her bright red mouth. He slowly lowered his face. Li Xiaolu's eyelashes fluttered, her eyes were filled with moisture, and her mouth opened slightly. Chen Tao." Her voice was trembling. Chen Tao kissed her thin lips. For a long time, Chen Tao let go of her lips and looked at the face in front of him. Very close, Chen Tao could smell a faint fragrance, which was Li Xiaolu's unique body fragrance. Li Xiaolu's eyelashes fluttered, and her eyes slowly opened, revealing her eyes filled with moisture. Meeting Chen Tao's gaze, Li Xiaolu blushed twice and hurriedly hid her face in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao was stunned for a moment. Feeling the delicate body in his arms and her body temperature, Chen Tao smiled, raised his hand, hugged her gently, slowly stroked her hair with his hand, got closer and smelled the fragrance of her hair, and said, "Aren't you afraid of me?" Li Xiaolu was startled, then she shook her head and said, "You are so kind to me, of course I won't be afraid." Chen Tao smiled, he leaned close to her ear and said softly, "But your sisters are always afraid of me, especially He Yuxuan, you know." Upon hearing this, Li Xiaolu seemed to have thought of something, and her face suddenly turned red. She clenched her small fist and beat Chen Tao's chest. "Don't say that kind of thing, you are good or bad. What happened to this man?" For a moment, Li Xiaolu was confused. She had just kissed him, and he started talking nonsense. He Yuxuan and Li Xiaolu have a good relationship, and they can talk easily. For a while, He Yuxuan was indeed a little afraid of Chen Tao. To be more precise, she loved and feared him. During that time, Chen Tao always bullied He Yuxuan, causing He Yuxuan to always complain to Li Xiaolu. Li Xiaolu blushed as she listened to He Yuxuan mention those things. So, Li Xiaolu knew. Now she listened to Chen Tao's hint. Li Xiaolu's heart was in turmoil. This man was too bad, wasn't he? Could it be that the gentleness and elegance he pretended to be in front of her before were all fake, and this was his true nature? Looking at Li Xiaolu's actions, Chen Tao smiled. "Then according to the rules, I will let you go back," the neutral voice sounded again. Chen Tao raised his face and took a look. The surrounding environment changed, he came back to his senses and looked around. Li Xiaolu also came out of Chen Tao's arms. She looked around, and her eyes were full of doubts. Isn't this my bedroom?" Chen Tao's eyes fell on the floor-to-ceiling window not far away, and he walked over and looked at the blue sky outside. "Indeed, this is indeed on base number 1. Did that guy move himself and Li Xiaolu here? This is too scary. He was able to move him and Li Xiaolu here without Chen Tao knowing." Chen Tao frowned tightly. "That guy is too scary. Fortunately, that guy is just playing around. If that guy wants to deal with the dragon civilization and subvert this universe, the result will be very terrifying. However, Chen Tao has a problem that he can't figure out. As far as Chen Tao knows, there is no celestial computer more powerful than Nebula in the entire universe. But how could there be a celestial computer more powerful than Nebula now?" Suddenly, Chen Tao's mind flashed. "No, there is no celestial computer more powerful than Nebula in the entire universe. Could it be her? My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 332. There is indeed a celestial computer in this universe that is more powerful than the Nebula. But no matter what, Chen Tao didn't think she would do these things. "What are you thinking about?" a voice came from the side. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao came back to his senses and looked at the source of the voice. What he saw was a delicate little face. The owner of this little face was Li Xiaolu. Li Xiaolu was looking at him with a puzzled look in her eyes. Looking at Li Xiaolu's expression, Chen Tao said, "It's okay." He smiled and looked at Li Xiaolu in front of him. Li Xiaolu was wearing a black off-shoulder gauze skirt, which was close to her slender and graceful figure. The skirt straps bound her slender waist. The skirt was relatively short, and you could see the pair of slender and straight legs wrapped in white pantyhose. She was wearing a pair of black high-heeled round boots. Her long hair was draped behind her like a waterfall. Under her bangs was a delicate little face, and under her narrow eyelashes were a pair of big eyes. Li Xiaolu was looking at Chen Tao with her twinkling eyes, with a hint of doubt in her eyes. Looking at the delicate girl in front of him, Chen Tao stepped closer to Li Xiaolu, stretched out his hand, and held Li Xiaolu's small hand. Li Xiaolu looked at her small hand held by Chen Tao, and her cheeks flushed. She slowly lowered her head, blushing, and said, "What are you doing?" Chen Tao looked at Li Xiaolu's shy look of lowering her head and looking at her toes. He smiled and said, "Why don't you call me brother Chen Tao?" Li Xiaolu was startled, her face was red. She raised her face slightly, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "We are like this, I still call you brother, it's weird." Chen Tao smiled, "What are we like?" He raised his big hand, lifted the hair that was stuck to her face, put it behind her ears, and held her small cheek with his big hand. His rough fingers rubbed her face. Li Xiaolu's face flushed, avoiding Chen Tao's sight, not daring to look at him. "That's it, you know." Li Xiaolu blushed and didn't dare to say anything. Seeing Li Xiaolu's expression, Chen Tao raised his hand and hugged Li Xiaolu horizontally. Li Xiaolu was startled, her face flushed, and she looked at Chen Tao nervously. "What?" Chen Tao looked at Li Xiaolu, smiled, and didn't respond to her. He put Li Xiaolu on the bed. He got close to Li Xiaolu's face and looked into her eyes. Chen Tao looked at the delicate face in front of him, he stroked her hair and looked into her eyes. Very close, Chen Tao could smell her unique body fragrance, and could also feel her breathing and her heartbeat. Her heartbeat was very fast, and it was obvious that she was very nervous. Chen Tao looked at Li Xiaolu, who was nervous, and his eyes were gentle. He said, "Do you know what obligations you have as my woman?" Li Xiaolu blushed, pretending not to know for sure, and shook her head. Chen Tao looked at Li Xiaolu and said with a smile, "Betty has a child." Li Xiaolu was slightly startled, and her eyes looked at Chen Tao with doubts. Why did Chen Tao say this at this time? Chen Tao looked at Li Xiaolu and said with a smile, "This is my woman's duty, help me have a baby, can you?" Li Xiaolu blushed, and she said, "No. No, I'm still young." Chen Tao looked at Li Xiaolu with a red face, and said with a smile, "Not young anymore." "No. No." Li Xiaolu shook her head and blushed, "You bully people, you were not like this before." Before, Chen Tao was so polite and gentle to her, just like an older brother. Why did Chen Tao change all of a sudden now? Li Xiaolu felt that Chen Tao was like a hungry wolf now, and she was like a little lamb, and he seemed to want to eat her anytime and anywhere. Chen Tao smiled, "It's too late to know my true face now." Li Xiaolu blushed, "Don't make trouble. If you want to make trouble, how can you not make trouble?" 2 hours later, Chen Tao was lying on the bed. Li Xiaolu was wearing a bathrobe and nestled in Chen Tao's arms like a kitten, with her back to Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at the ceiling, then turned his head slightly and looked at Li Xiaolu beside him. Li Xiaolu had her back to Chen Tao, and I don't know what she was doing. He turned slightly to the side, gently hugged Li Xiaolu, and looked over to see what Li Xiaolu was doing. Only then did Chen Tao realize that Li Xiaolu was looking at a mirror. Through the mirror, you can see the picture inside. This mirror was the one Rose gave her before, and it can see all the civilizations in the known universe. Chen Tao approached Li Xiaolu, hugged her, and said with a smile, "What are you looking at?" Li Xiaolu was slightly startled, she turned her head and looked at Chen Tao, and a smile appeared on her small face. Looking at this, Chen Tao smiled. Li Xiaolu retracted her gaze, looked at the mirror, and said, "This is the mirror that Sister Rose gave me. It can see the development of other civilizations. I have been looking for a while, wanting to see if there is a civilization that looks exactly like us, and then I found this. This." Chen Tao lay beside Li Xiaolu, smelling Li Xiaolu's hair and looking forward. Through the mirror, Chen Tao saw two humans. There are many civilizations in this universe, but the evolutionary directions of those civilizations are somewhat different. Humans evolved from ancient apes, but many other civilizations, except for Earth, are not like this. Some intelligent creatures evolved from fish genes into humans. They look half human and half fish and can only live in the sea. The dragons of the dragon civilization evolved from dinosaurs. Pure humans are rare in other civilizations, but they are not non-existent. The civilization where Villia is located is also a human civilization like Chentao. Chentao is a little interested now. What will the new human civilization found by Li Xiaolu look like this time? Chentao smelled the fragrance of Li Xiaolu's hair, came closer, kissed Li Xiaolu's hair, and then looked at the mirror in front of him. This is how it looked. Chentao noticed that the two people in the mirror climbed onto a humanoid machine and then entered the humanoid machine. See this? Chentao's eyebrows slightly relaxed. Robot. Li Xiaolu chuckled, rolled her eyes at Chentao, and said, "What robot? That's a mecha weapon. Unlike us, they drive such humanoid weapons to fight." Chentao's eyebrows slightly relaxed, and said, "Well, this is equivalent to a humanoid tank." Almost, Li Xiaolu said softly. Hearing this, Chentao smiled and said, "I guess Wu Yao will like this kind of thing very much." Li Xiaolu smiled and said, "Not only like it, Wu Yao saw this, and ran to her warehouse to make a set for herself." "Is that so?" Chentao smiled. "Yes, according to Wu Yao's personality, if she doesn't tinker with a set herself, she won't be her." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 333. Mecha, this kind of weapon is quite interesting. Chentao looked at Li Xiaolu's small face. From this angle, she could see her delicate profile, and her big eyes could be seen under the long and narrow eyelashes. Very cute. Chentao slowly approached Li Xiaolu's face and kissed her cheek. Li Xiaolu's face was red, but the corners of her mouth were slightly raised, showing joy. Chentao said with a smile, "Wu Yao will like this thing, but how come you, a little girl, also like this kind of mechanical thing?" Li Xiaolu shook her head slightly and said, "No, I am more interested in their rules." "Rule?" Chentao looked at Li Xiaolu and said with a smile, "What are the rules?" Li Xiaolu said, "The civilization they live in has experienced a terrible disaster, and their place is filled with a terrible virus. Creatures infected with that virus, whether they are humans or animals, will turn into different monsters. Those monsters have occupied the planet they live on," Li Xiaolu said. "Now they can only huddle in a besieged city, using high walls to keep those monsters out, but the resources within the walls are limited. So their rule: the organizer will organize a group of people to go outside the wall to look for resources." Li Xiaolu looked at Chentao and said, "They call the disaster they experienced before the doomsday, and the people who survived within the wall are called survivors." Li Xiaolu looked at Chentao and said, "Do you think, will viruses like theirs appear in our planetary civilization?" Hearing this, Chentao smiled and said, "Even if there are, those viruses are of no use to us. As long as we have a thought, those viruses will be gone." Li Xiaolu's eyes glowed with a hint of luster. She pursed her thin lips and said with a smile, "That's right, we apply technology to genes and are essentially immune to viruses. They are completely different from us. Their research is external. Science and technology." Li Xiaolu looked at the picture in the mirror, and she was silent for a moment. She seemed to remember something. She put away the mirror, then looked at Chentao and said, "Let's not talk about this anymore. The person who attacked us before, do you have any thoughts?" Chentao was slightly startled. He did not expect that Li Xiaolu would actually say this. Chentao laughed and said, "Why did you suddenly mention this?" Li Xiaolu looked at Chentao, her eyes glowing, and said, "You are the king of the dragon civilization, but that person can't even deal with you. If that person wants to take action against Earth Star, it will be over. Perhaps, then Earth-star civilization will really usher in its end. She looked at Chen Tao with moving eyes. Li Xiaolu is not stupid. In fact, she has always been smart. Of course Li Xiaolu knew what the existence of a person with more powerful technology than Chen Tao meant. Chen Tao looked at Li Xiaolu, raised his hand, lifted up her hair, held her small face in his hand, and slowly hid her face in Li Xiaolu's. He lowered his face. Kissed Li Xiaolu. Parted lips. Li Xiaolu fluttered her eyelashes and slowly opened her eyes, with a hint of confusion in them. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Not necessarily." Li Xiaolu was slightly startled. She looked at Chen Tao with doubtful eyes. "What?" Chen Tao said with a smile, "Although I am the king of dragons, in fact, in our current universe, besides me, there is another person who has a more powerful celestial computer than me. If that enemy really wants to continue to deal with us, you can use that person's strength." "Is it stronger than your celestial computer?" Li Xiaolu's eyes were filled with doubts. "Is it?" Of course Chen Tao smiled and said, "I will find her later and tell me about that matter." Li Xiaolu pursed her thin lips and smiled, "Yes." Chen Tao gently stroked her messy hair and gently held her in his arms. Li Xiaolu closed her eyes. Chen Tao gently stroked her hair and comforted her. After about half an hour, Chen Tao could feel the girl in his arms breathing steadily. He looked down at Li Xiaolu. She had her eyes closed and had fallen asleep. Seeing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. He carefully got out of bed, put on his clothes, and looked at Li Xiaolu, who was still sleeping. He looked away and disappeared. When he appeared again, Chen Tao appeared in Betty's bedroom. The Betty in this bedroom is the future Betty's bedroom. He looked and his eyes fell forward. On the spacious bed, a beautiful figure was wearing a thin white shirt, sitting against the bedside, looking at the scene in front of her. When Chen Tao came over, he saw her sideways. She was sitting sideways. She had a small figure, fair and delicate skin, and looked particularly cute. She was wearing a loose shirt, and from the bottom down, one leg was slender and straight, and the other was slightly bent. She has long red hair, which is somewhat messy and draped over her shoulders. Her profile is very beautiful. Under the long and narrow eyelashes, there is a pair of ruby eyes. Under the high bridge of the nose, there is a small and thin lip. Very cute. There is a red collar on her slender neck. She folded her hands on her chest and looked at the scene in front of her with her big eyes. Suddenly, she seemed to feel something and looked here subconsciously. He happened to meet Chen Tao's eyes. Chen Tao smiled and said, "What are you looking at?" Chen Tao walked over and looked at the screen Betty was looking at. Through that screen, Chen Tao could see that it was himself that was displayed in the screen. It felt like there was a camera facing Chen Tao's back. Chen Tao was slightly startled. He blinked and looked at Betty. Betty pursed her lips. The screen disappeared. Chen Tao retracted his gaze and looked at Betty. Betty looked at Chen Tao with her ruby-like eyes. Their eyes met. Chen Tao smiled, "You've been looking at me." Betty said, "Yeah." She smiled and said, "You are my man, paying attention to you is what I want to do." Chen Tao nodded slightly, and he slowly sat next to Betty. Betty stood up. Chen Tao looked at Betty, and Betty came over and sat in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao was slightly startled. He smiled, hugged the petite Betty in his arms, and gently stroked her arm. Betty hid her little head in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao smelled Betty's hair, kissed her hair, and said with a smile, "Today, did someone come to see you?" Betty blinked, raised her face, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "Yes, you are it." She smiled. Chen Tao looked at Betty's eyes, he smiled and said, "Besides me." Betty was shining. She looked at Chen Tao, she looked at Chen Tao deeply, and said, "Guess, if you guess right, I will tell you." Chen Tao said, Rose. Betty's eyebrows stretched slightly. She was happy. How do you know? My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 334. Chen Tao looked at Betty and said with a smile, the person who kidnapped Li Xiaolu is you, right? Betty blinked her big eyes. She smiled and didn't say anything. Looking at Betty's baby face with a smile. Chen Tao smiled, raised his hand, and gently put the hair on her cheek behind her ear. Chen Tao said, there is only one person in the known universe who has a more powerful astronomical computer than me, and that is you from the future. Then, the purpose of kidnapping Li Xiaolu is not to hurt me, nor to hurt Li Xiaolu, but to promote the relationship between me and Li Xiaolu. Chen Tao said, I think the only person who would have this idea is Rose. And you have a good relationship with Rose. He looked at Betty and said, more importantly, you and Rose have the habit of peeping at me, so if you have that habit, the person who kidnapped Li Xiaolu, you should also know about asking me to go. Since you know, you will definitely not be indifferent. After all, these are connected. Chen Tao looked at Betty, then the result is obvious. The enemy who is unwilling to show up is you. Betty showed a playful smile. She approached Chen Tao, raised her hand, and hugged Chen Tao's neck. She looked at Chen Tao with obsessed eyes and said with a smile, you guessed right, I did this, so, what are you going to do? Punish me. Chen Tao leaned down and pressed Betty on the bed. Betty's ruby-like eyes looked at Chen Tao, and her delicate baby face was filled with a playful smile. Chen Tao was a little helpless. He scratched Betty's nose with his fingers and said with a smile, it's called guarding against thieves day and night, but it's hard to guard against thieves at home. You girl, it seems that if I don't show you some power, you don't know how powerful I am. Betty pursed her thin lips and said with a smile, come on, I'm not afraid. Chen Tao was happy. Okay, let's see if you are afraid later. After meeting the guy who had more powerful technology than himself, Chen Tao was a little uneasy. He thought a lot about this matter. But he never thought that it would be Betty who did it. It seems that it won't work if Betty is not taught a lesson. She even dared to plot against Chen Tao. The question is how to punish her? Betty, who has a lowly body, is so cute. Chen Tao doesn't have the heart to beat such a cute girl. If he can't beat her, there is only one way to punish her. 2 days passed in a blink of an eye. This morning, Chen Tao slowly opened his eyes and looked at the familiar ceiling in front of him. He slowly retracted his gaze, turned his head, and looked at Betty beside him. Betty was lying on her side, small and petite, just like a kitten. Her long red hair was draped messily behind her, and her slender and delicate figure outlined a beautiful pattern. Looking at this scene, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he turned slightly to look at Betty in front of him. This Betty from the future. In her timeline, she was a high-ranking existence, and it could almost be said that she could do whatever she wanted. But in this timeline, she gave up everything just to stay with Chen Tao. To be honest, Chen Tao couldn't understand this kind of thing. Chen Tao didn't know what there was to fear about the loneliness brought by infinite life. After all, he had never experienced long-term loneliness. So it was incomprehensible. But what Chen Tao knew was that the woman in front of him was for him. She was willing to give everything she had, and even changed her body shape to satisfy Chen Tao. How could Chen Tao not cherish such a girl? Chen Tao covered her little face and rubbed her cheek with his fingers. It was smooth and delicate. Betty's eyelashes moved, and she slowly opened her eyes, revealing her ruby-like eyes. Their eyes met. Chen Tao smiled. Betty's eyes were a little tired. She pursed her thin lips, and hid her face in Chen Tao's arms. You are so scary. Chen Tao blinked and smiled. Is it scary? It turns out that our Red Dragon King Betty is afraid of something. Betty said, what Red Dragon King? In front of you, I am just a little lamb, and you are a big hungry wolf. In front of you, there is only little woman Betty, not Red Dragon King. She drew circles on Chen Tao's chest with her little hand and said weakly, I am happy if you love me, and I will be scared if you don't love me. Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, you are so naughty, you must teach you a lesson. If you want to teach, you can't hurt me. Betty pursed her thin lips and slowly hid her little face in Chen Tao's arms. I know, I will never dare to do it again. Chen Tao smiled, hugged her gently, kissed her forehead, and said, this is good, this is my baby. Feeling Chen Tao's love, Betty's eyes were shining with a hint of light, and the corners of her mouth were slightly raised. These 2 days, she felt the horror of Chen Tao. He didn't pity her, which gave her a strange feeling. Although she didn't hate him so much, it would make her feel empty inside. Now that she felt Chen Tao's love, she was happy. She felt much better. Chen Tao accompanied Betty tenderly. It seemed that Chen Tao's teaching method would still be effective. Chen Tao smiled. Not long after, Betty fell asleep. Chen Tao looked at Betty, who was sleeping soundly in his arms. Would she be tired too? Chen Tao thought about it. He thought that Betty might be tired or too comfortable. Chen Tao smiled. She fell asleep, but Chen Tao was not tired. He didn't want to disturb Betty, so he got off the bed. He went back to his room, took a shower, put on a bathrobe, sat on the sofa, and looked at the scenery outside the French window. Chen Tao unconsciously thought of the civilization that Li Xiaolu mentioned. Mecha civilization? Chen Tao thought about it and had nothing to do. He raised his hand, and a picture appeared in front of him. Through this picture, Chen Tao could see the mecha civilization he had seen before. In the picture, 2 off-road vehicles full of mecha atmosphere passed by on a plane. Boom boom boom. The off-road vehicles whizzed past. In one of the off-road vehicles, there was a man and a woman. The man drove the car, and the woman looked around with a telescope. She picked up a walkie-talkie and said, I didn't find any light beasts here. The walkie-talkie in her ear also sounded, I don't have any here either. The woman nodded slightly, retracted her gaze, looked ahead, crossed her legs, and said, there is still half an hour to the destination. It seems that this time the task of hunting resources can be easier. Pei AI, don't let your guard down. Light beasts will appear anytime and anywhere, a voice came from the walkie-talkie. Pei AI heard it and said, yes, Captain. Chen Tao, who was looking at this picture, squinted his eyes. Through the picture, Chen Tao could see that there were groups of monsters approaching near the 2 off-road vehicles. Of course, the people in the off-road vehicle didn't know this. Chen Tao crossed his arms and said, it seems that their technology is not very good. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 335. Chen Tao did not help. Within the screen, the 2 off-road vehicles drove into a fruit forest. This fruit forest is covered with many fruits. Pei AI looked at the fruit trees around him and said, today's fruit trees are much better than last year. The man in charge of driving the off-road vehicle next to him said calmly, be careful, we are the Forerunners. The mission this time is to determine whether there are thunder beasts here, and at the same time install a barrier device to ensure the safety of the picking troops behind. Safety. At this time, an off-road vehicle drove up next to Pei AI. In the off-road vehicle, a woman with short silver hair was driving. The woman looked at Pei AI and said, stop here. 2 off-road vehicles stopped. 2 off-road vehicles carried 2 humanoid mechas respectively. 4 people in total. Through the screen, Chen Tao looked at the scene in front of him. He noticed that all 4 of them were wearing tight leather jackets. The woman named Pei AI is wearing a tight-fitting black leather jacket. The tight-fitting leather jacket fits Pei AI's curvy figure, and the close-fitting fabric fits her waist. If you continue down, you can see that the tight-fitting leather jacket fits her waist. Buttocks. Further down, the legs are slender and straight, with a pair of black cylindrical high-heeled boots under their feet. She has ink-like hair that is tied up, revealing her long and white neck. This outfit coupled with Pei Ai's figure makes it difficult to look away. This dress is simply amazing. Chen Tao crossed his chest with his hands, touched his chin, and thought to himself, do you want to find a chance to let Zicheng and the others wear such clothes to play? Unfortunately, the view didn't last long. The four people entered the humanoid mecha one after another. The humanoid mecha directly wrapped the bodies of the four people. All that can be seen now are four huge humanoid mechas that are nearly 3 meters high. The silver-haired woman said calmly, spread out and install devices in this fruit forest as quickly as possible along the route we planned before. Yes. The four of them responded at the same time. The four people spread out in four directions. Seeing this, the scene in front of Chen Tao was divided into four scenes. He could see every move of these four people. Chen Tao had nothing to do, so he lay on the sofa and looked at the picture above. He is very laid back. In the painting, Pei Ai was driving a humanoid mecha. She looked around. I heard that in the old world, these fruits were plentiful, and you could eat as much as you wanted. Now in this new world, resources are extremely limited. Only the excellent people in the elite areas can eat the fruits, Pei Ai said. Things in the old world are really desirable, but it's a pity that it's the end of the world now. Suddenly, Pei Ai noticed a tree. A pair of bones clinging to each other. Through the data displayed by the mecha, she could see a pattern outlined by lines. The bones turned into two virtual humanoid figures in the screen, a man and a woman, leaning on each other. Pei Ai stared at the pile of bones and slowed down slightly. In the sanctuary, in order to ensure human survival, the genetic optimization plan was launched. Simply put, men and women are not allowed to be together in private in the sanctuary. If you want to have a child, you need to apply and then choose a spouse based on the results calculated by the computer. Only second best. Men and women are not allowed to have too close a relationship, otherwise it will violate the laws of the sanctuary. Just die. But seeing the bones leaning against each other in front of him, Pei Ai felt strange. Roar. A low growl. Hearing this voice, Pei Ai's pupils froze slightly, and she quickly looked towards the source of the voice. Upon taking a look, Pei Ai found a dark monster standing directly in front of him. It looks just like a leopard, but its size is twice that of a leopard, and its back seems to be studded with spheres glowing with blue light. Pei Ai's expression became more solemn. Damn it, it's Lighterman. Captain and Ching, I have a thunder beast here, Pei Ai said. How many? Pei Ai said, 1 and. Captain and Ching said, can it be solved? Okay, Pei Ai said. Then dispose of it quickly. After installing the rear device, leave immediately, and Ching said. Pei Ai said, okay. After saying that, looking at the lightman in front of him, the humanoid mecha raised its arm, revealing a dark Gatling-type machine. Pei Ai aimed at Thunderman. Pei Ai's eyes turned slightly cold and he said, die. Bang bang bang. Terrifying bullets were fired at Lightman like a violent storm. Lightman ran quickly, dodging wildly to avoid bullets. Pei Ai gritted her teeth. Death. She held the operating lever tightly and pressed the launch button. Lighterman dodged Pei Ai's attack and pounced on Pei Ai. Pei Ai, who was wearing a humanoid mecha, was thrown to the ground by Lightman. The thunder beast opened its mouth towards Pei Ai and bit Pei Ai with a bloody mouth. Pei Ai grabbed the light beast's bloody mouth with his hands. Humph, Pei Ai snorted, and the humanoid mecha's hand clenched into a fist and hit the light beast's head hard. Ouch! With a scream, Lightman flew 3 meters away. Seeing this, Pei Ai got up and drew a huge sword from behind. Pei Ai moved suddenly, and the iron plate under the humanoid mecha opened, revealing 4 wheels. The wheels spun, and the thrusters behind the humanoid mecha spurted out flames. PAI drove the humanoid mecha and rushed towards Lightman with the speed of wheels and thrusters. The big knife in his hand slashed at Lightman. Puff. Lightman broke into two pieces and lay on the ground without moving. Seeing this, PAI put the big knife behind her back, then picked up the giant Gatling on the ground, and drove the humanoid mecha to the destination quickly. Through the screen, Chen Tao took in this scene. He crossed his arms and watched with interest. The fighting style of wearing mecha is very rough, which is completely different from the genetic technology battle on Chen Tao's side. Looking at this new thing, Chen Tao is somewhat interested. In the screen, PAI seems to have reached the destination. In front of PAI is a device covered by weeds. PAI drove the humanoid mecha over, pushed away the weeds, and revealed the true face of the device. This is a metal platform made of metal, with a triangular pit in the middle of the metal platform. Chen Tao looked at the metal platform, his eyes glowing with blue code, and used the gene function to analyze the object. In a moment, Chen Tao knew what it was. Through analysis, Chen Tao knew that there were 4 metal platforms in total, and the triangular object was an energy block. Only when the energy blocks were installed on these 4 metal platforms would the metal platforms form a barrier. However, because the energy of the energy blocks could not last too long, it could only last for 1 day. This area was surrounded by the so-called rat beasts, which could invade at any time. Did PAI and the others plan to protect this place first and then let people come to pick resources? The humanoid mecha raised its hand, the door on the mechanical arm opened, and a triangular blue object appeared. PAI picked up the blue object and hit it on the metal platform. The blue object on the metal platform emitted a blue light, which spread to the entire metal platform. PAI raised his face and looked around. She frowned, then said to the intercom, "Captain Ching, I have completed the mission. How are you, Ka-Fei and Bassin?" "I encountered some trouble here, but it has been resolved," Captain Ching said lightly. Ka-Fei said, "I just installed it." Silence, no sound. And Ching said, "Bassin." No response. Bassin, PAI's expression also had a hint of suspicion. At the same time, Chen Tao was lying on the bed, and he looked at the picture where the man named Bassin was. In that picture, the mecha driven by Bassin was already in tatters, and a group of rat beasts surrounded it. Bassin was bitten to pieces, and now he was just a corpse. Only Bassin's intercom was making a sound. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 336. When Bassin didn't get a response, the other 3 suddenly became nervous. And Ching frowned and said, "I guess Bassin had an accident. We have to go find out the situation." "Yes," PAI responded. Food resources in the sanctuary are very scarce. The food in the sanctuary can only last for another week. Our mission this time is very important. If we cannot complete the mission this time, then the people in the sanctuary will starve and die. And Ching said, "It's rare that we can reach this fruit forest safely. This is a rare opportunity for us to try our best to understand the situation." And Ching looked solemn as she said, "Even if we die, we must at least clarify the situation and report it to the headquarters." "Yes." PAI and Ka-Fei responded at the same time. PAI quickly moved towards Bassin's target point. This matter is of great importance, so each humanoid mecha is equipped with 2 energy blocks to avoid problems. All resources are in short supply in the sanctuary, and food is the top priority. The purpose of PAI's Vanguard team is to find out the safety of this fruit forest and to set up protective devices at the same time as the picking and transport troops arrive from behind. But everyone knows that outside the sanctuary, anything can happen. Now that Bassin has lost his voice, he is probably in danger. What made Pei Ai most uneasy was that Basin was driving a mecha and he also had a walkie-talkie. Mechas are very hard, and until now, there have been very few creatures that can harm mechas. But the Basin man died without even saying a word, which meant that he was probably killed instantly. Thinking of this, Pei Ai felt inexplicably uneasy. Pei Ai believes that Enqing and Ka Fei also understand this matter. The risk factor of this matter is very high, but even though we know the danger, we can only get over it. Ho ho ho. Low growls sounded all around. Hear this growl. Pei Ai condensed, and she looked forward. On the left and right sides of the front, groups of light beasts were approaching Pei Ai. When Pei Ai saw this, she didn't stop and immediately pointed Gatling straight ahead while running. Bang bang bang. Crazy bullets hit the lightman that was blocking the way like a violent storm. Pei Ai, what happened? So many gunshots, and Qing's voice was solemn. Pei Ai said, there are thunder beasts, and I estimate there are more than 30 of them. I am fighting them. Roar. A thunder beast rushed over from the right and knocked down Pei Ai. Pei Ai, who was driving the mecha, was thrown away. His body fell to the ground and rolled several times. After hitting the tree trunk hard, Pei Ai inside the mecha let out a muffled groan. With a clang, Gatling fell to the ground. Pei Ai. What's going on? And Qing's voice was solemn. Pei Ai woke up and struggled to get up. She looked at the thunder beasts surrounding her, and then at Gatling, who was already surrounded by the beasts. She pressed her lower teeth, and then pulled out the big knife behind her. Out. Pei Ai said, I'm fine. You continue to perform the mission and I can escape. There was silence on the intercom. And Qing's solemn voice sounded, Kfei, you carry out your mission, and I will support Pei Ai. No, Captain. You are relatively close to the target point, and my target point is relatively close to Pei Ai. I can quickly support him there, Kfei said. And Qing said decisively, okay. Take action now. Those thunder beasts didn't give Pei Ai time to breathe, they pounced on Pei Ai. Pei Ai, who was driving a humanoid mecha, held the 4-meter-long broadsword, jumped into the group of beasts, knocked away a light beast, and then chopped one to death with the broadsword. But there are too many lightmen. When Pei Ai killed one, another pounced on him. Other side. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai who was struggling with a big knife in the screen. His eyebrows wrinkled slightly. The humanoid mecha piloted by this woman is quite strong. It seems that these thunder beasts cannot destroy the mecha for a while. However, if time continues to grow, it will be different. Sure enough, after Pei Ai used the strength of the humanoid mecha to withstand the attack of the light beast, he killed more than 10 heads. She was thrown to the ground again. Kaka. Pei Ai's pupils froze, and she found that the gap on the head of the humanoid mecha was torn open. Pei Ai's face turned pale. The humanoid mecha is indeed very strong, but it also has a weak point, and that is the joints of the humanoid mecha. And now it's happened. Bang. A piece of metal flew out. That piece of metal is exactly the head part of the humanoid mecha. The mecha's head flew out, and Pei Ai's face inside was revealed. Pei Ai's face was as pale as paper, and she shouted, "Get away!" Feeling the threat to her life, she controlled the humanoid mecha's arms and waved them around, swatting away the lighter beasts around her. But at this time, Pei Ai felt a tightening in her wrist, and her heart froze, and she found that a thunder beast had bitten the mecha's arm tightly, preventing Pei Ai from swinging it freely. And in this way, Pei Ai's head has no defense. A light beast flew toward Pei Ai's head, opened its big mouth, revealing its blue mouth, and bit Pei Ai's head fiercely. It's over. These two words passed through Pei Ai's head. Bang. There was a loud noise, and the body of the thunder beast exploded. Along with the fire, Lightman's body flew out. Ouch. Pei heard the scream of the thunder beast. Pei's eyes lit up slightly, and she quickly opened the bite of the thunder beast next to her, and looked at the source of the cannonball. At first glance, I saw another man in a white mecha holding a large caliber firearm, pointing this way, with flames coming from the muzzle. Seeing this, Pei's eyes lit up. Kfei. Kfei pulled the barrel of the gun, and there was a click. He said in a deep voice, "Is it okay?" "Yeah." Pei drove the mecha and waved the big knife in his hand, killing another light beast. Kfei said, "Then continue. Fight out." "Good." Pei responded. Suddenly, there was a strange sound of flesh and blood being separated. Pei was stunned. I saw a blue sharp object piercing the head of the mecha driven by Kafei. Pei's pupils trembled. Kfei. Pei took a closer look and found that the sharp object was a tail, the tip of the tail. And the owner of that tail is a creature that is blue and looks like a lioness, but this creature has an extremely long tail. Kfei's arms drooped and the gun in his hand fell to the ground. The creature flicked its tail. Kfei's body flew out and hit the ground with a loud bang. Kfei looked at Kfei's body on the ground. Her face was as pale as paper. She looked at the creature with a sharp tail. "Look at that blue tail." At this moment, Pei finally knew why Basin couldn't even make a sound when he died. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 337. Pei, what's going on? And Qing's serious voice came. Pei stared straight at the creature that was slowly approaching here. She turned pale, swallowed, and said, "It's a strange beast. It has a dark blue tail that is 10 meters long, and the tip is very sharp. When it first appeared, it directly pierced Kfei's mecha with its tail. Took away Kfei's life. I think Basin also died in its hands. More than 50 years have passed since the end of time. Human beings are huddled in a city called the Sanctuary, using high walls to keep out the virus-infected monsters. The only time humans come out is to search for resources. In the past 50 years, the outside world has undergone earth-shaking changes, and many unknown creatures have appeared in the outside world. Some are named and some are unnamed, and those unnamed and powerful and dangerous creatures are collectively called strange beasts. Generally speaking, warriors who encounter those special beasts will basically die. And now Pei has realized that she is dead. Don't mention it, her head is now exposed. Even if her head is protected by a mecha, her tail can directly penetrate the mecha and kill Pei. It's over. The special beast didn't talk nonsense to Pei at all. It sank slightly and pounced on Pei. In mid-air, the flexible and sharp tail stabbed directly into Pei's head. The speed was so fast that Pei couldn't even react, and the tail was already in front of her eyes. Knowing that he was bound to die, Pei closed his eyes subconsciously. Bang! Suddenly, there was a muffled sound. The whole ground trembled. Ouch! A scream sounded in Pei's ears. The severe pain I imagined did not come. Pei slowly opened her eyes and looked at the source of the sound. At first glance, Pei was stunned by the eye-catching scene. In front of Pei, the strange beast just now was stepped on the ground by a huge mechanical foot, and it seemed to be dead. Pei raised her face and looked, her pupils trembling. She saw a huge humanoid mecha. This humanoid mecha is 10 meters tall, just like a hill. It looks very scary. And on the shoulders of this 10-meter tall humanoid mecha stood a man, who was looking at Pei. Pei met the man's gaze, and her eyes trembled slightly. Who is this? In the sanctuary, the population is limited, and people are also divided into superior people with superior genes and inferior people with inferior genes. Those who can pilot humanoid mechas can only be selected among the human as mecha warriors. Pei, the mecha warrior in the sanctuary, knew him well. but Pei Ai didn't recognize the man in front of him. Who is this man? And, was he driving that huge mecha? The lightman next to them saw the special beast being trampled to death, and they all ran away. After a while, the surrounding area became empty. The huge humanoid mecha stretched out its big mechanical hand towards the man. The man stepped on his big hand. The humanoid mecha carefully sent the man down to Pei Ai. The man came face to face with Pei Ai. He smiled, crossed his arms across his chest, looked at Pei Ai, and said, "What do you call her?" When Pei Ai heard this, she said, "Pei Ai." The man said, "It's a nice name. My name is Chen Tao." Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai and said, "Can I make a friend?" Pei Ai adjusted her mood slightly and looked at the strange man in front of her. "It's confirmed, Pei Ai can be sure." The smiling man in front of him was definitely not from the sanctuary. Then there is only one possibility, he is someone outside the sanctuary. Survivors outside the sanctuary? This title is incredible. Pei Ai adjusted her mood. She looked at the huge mecha. She looked at Chen Tao, who is driving inside. This woman did not answer Chen Tao's question. Although Chen Tao saved her life, she was still wary of Chen Tao. Her reaction was reasonable and within Chen Tao's expectations. After all, in the last days, it is normal to be cautious when a stranger appears. Chen Tao said, "I am in control. Unlike your mecha, my mecha is controlled remotely from the outside. I put the chip into my head and I can control it with my will." Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao. "Pei Ai, who are you talking to and what's going on?" came the intercom. Pei Ai raised his hand, pressed the intercom in his ear, and said, "I met a man driving a giant humanoid mecha. He seemed to be a human being living outside the sanctuary. He saved my life. The human survivors outside the sanctuary are incredible. I am installing the device here. If possible, you can keep him and take him to the car and let him return to the sanctuary with us." And Qing's voice came. Pei Ai said, "Yes." She looked at Chen Tao and said, "Thank you for saving my life. If possible, can you come with me?" Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai and said, "The beautiful woman invited me to go home with her when we first met her. As a man, I think it's a dream come true." Pei Ai was startled and her face turned slightly red. "Do you always speak so frivolously?" Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai, he smiled and said, "It's okay." "Then, you agreed?" Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Of course." Pei Ai nodded slightly and said, "Let's go, I'll lead the way." "Okay." Pei Ai drove the humanoid mecha to lead the way in front. Chen Tao stood on the palm of the giant mecha, and the giant humanoid mecha followed. Chen Tao was interested in taking a look at the civilization. Anyway, he had nothing to do, so he just had some fun. As for the giant mecha that seemed to shock Pei Ai, it was just something Chen Tao rode casually. For Chen Tao, it was nothing. Suddenly, Chen Tao was slightly startled, and he found that Pei Ai had stopped. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai, who frowned and operated the mecha cabin with her hands. Chen Tao said, "What's wrong?" Pei Ai frowned and said, "Maybe the engine of the mecha was broken when it was attacked just now and it can't run." "Well, it can't move, right?" Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai. Pei Ai nodded helplessly. Seeing this, Chen Tao controlled the robot's big hand and placed it beside Pei Ai. He looked at Pei Ai and said, "If you don't mind, take mine." Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao. She was a little helpless, but she could only get out of the mecha cabin and jump onto the mechanical hand. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai in front of him. Pei Ai was wearing a black tight leather jacket. When she jumped out of the mecha cabin, her figure full of lines made Chen Tao unable to move his eyes away. Pei Ai was startled. She said, "What are you looking at?" Chen Tao touched the back of his head, retracted his gaze, and said, "Nothing." Pei Ai's eyes were shining. She retracted her gaze, looked ahead, and said, "Keep going forward." "Okay," Chen Tao said. The huge mecha continued to move forward under Chen Tao's control. The humanoid mecha raised its arm and placed its palm on its chest. This robot is 10 meters tall, comparable to the height of a 3-story building, but when the palm is placed in front of the chest, the height is not low. Pei Ai sat on the cold mechanical palm and looked at the scenery ahead. "Are you a human who survived outside the sanctuary?" Pei Ai asked. "My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 338. Pei Ai speculated that Chen Tao was probably the human being who survived the apocalypse. But in any case, this is all speculation, and Pei Ai still has to make sure. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai beside him. Pei Ai was sitting with his legs wrapped in tight leather fabrics naturally straightened, slender and straight. This black bodysuit fits her figure full of lines and matches her fair and delicate face. The fabric around her waist was stretched out and the lines were beautiful. Pei Ai was slightly startled. She seemed to feel something and subconsciously looked back at Chen Tao. Meet Chen Tao's gaze. Pei Ai was slightly startled, her face flushed slightly, and she said, "What are you looking at?" Hearing this, Chen Tao looked away and coughed. In fact, Chen Tao was very honest at first, but after staying with his women for a long time, he naturally developed some bad habits. For example, the habit of glaring with eyes and touching with hands. Pei Ai looked away and looked at the giant mecha beside her. She said, "Even with the technology of our holy domain, we can't make such a giant mecha. Even if we can make it, it cannot use energy to maintain its movement." As he spoke, Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao and said, "Who made this thing?" Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai, and he smiled and said, "Want to know?" When Pei Ai heard this, she said, "Of course." Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai's big clear eyes and said, "If I said that I made this thing, would you believe it?" Pei Ai was stunned for a moment, her face was full of surprise. Pei Ai slowly adjusted her mood, nodded slightly, and said, "I believe it." Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai's innocent eyes and smiled, "Thank you for your trust." Pei Ai withdrew her gaze and stopped looking at Chen Tao. She said, "Are there any other survivors outside the sanctuary?" Chen Tao said, "As far as I know, I am the only one where I am." Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao subconsciously, "Are you alone?" "Yes," Chen Tao said, "My parents left me when I was very young, and I have been living alone since I was a child." Chen Tao didn't lie to him. His parents did leave Chen Tao when Chen Tao was very young. However, what Chen Tao was talking about was on another planet. Pei Ai's eyes glowed and she said, "A child without a companion lives in this world full of monsters. It's incredible." "It's nothing incredible." Chen Tao put his head in his hands, lying on his palms, looking at the sky, and said, "My parents are not here, but there are many intelligent robots where I live to take care of my daily life. If you lie, of course you have to tell the lie." Chen Tao's purpose is to blend into the civilization and see its situation up close. If you can't tell lies, how can you get in? Intelligent robot, Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at the blue sky and said, "Yes, it is a human-like robot that will take care of my daily life." Pei Ai's eyes glowed with a strange light. "If there is such a thing, I really want to see it." Hearing this, Chen Tao turned to look at Pei Ai and said with a smile, "My parents said that only their daughters-in-law can go to that place. Do you want to be their daughter-in-law?" Of course that place doesn't exist. Since it's a lie, it's better not to let her see it with her own eyes. Therefore, Chen Tao chose to use this method of teasing her to change the topic. Chen Tao could imagine Pei Ai blushing and then getting angry when he heard this. But the scene before him was beyond Chen Tao's expectation. I saw confusion in Pei Ai's eyes. "Daughter-in-law? What is that?" Chen Tao was slightly startled. Although the language spoken by Chen Tao is incompatible with the language of this world, the translator written by Chen Tao can convert the vocabulary spoken by Chen Tao into the vocabulary of this world. If the word daughter-in-law existed, Pei Ai would definitely understand it. But she didn't understand, which was strange. Chen Tao slowly sat up and said, daughter-in-law means partner. When a woman marries a man, then that woman is that man's wife. Pei Ai shook her head and said, I don't understand what you are talking about. What does partner mean? What does marriage mean? There was curiosity in her eyes. She looked at Chen Tao and seemed to remember something. She said, I see. These words you said are from the old world. Old world vocabulary. Now it was Chen Tao's turn to be curious. Pei Ai nodded slightly and said, you don't know that besides you, there are many other human beings. Those humans now live in a place called the sanctuary. In the sanctuary, for the survival of human beings reproduce, and the ruling class establishes new laws of the sanctuary. She looked at Chen Tao and said, a relationship like parents cannot exist in the holy realm. In the sanctuary, resources are scarce and limited. They believe that only by using limited resources on humans with superior genes can they play the greatest role and continue human life. The number of superior genes is limited, so if we continue to use the old if that kind of relationship exists in the world, Pei Ai said, the superior genes will be restricted and cannot be preserved to the maximum extent. Pei Ai said, therefore, Sanctuary launched the superior gene breeding program, using computer calculations to select men and women with superior genes, match them, and give birth to offspring. Pei Ai said, relationships like those in the old world will not exist in the holy realm. Those are the bad habits of the old world. Although I don't know what you mean by marrying a daughter-in-law, I think it should be the old world. Bad habit. Chen Tao was a little confused after hearing this. He collected his thoughts for a moment, then looked at Pei Ai and said, after calculating the match, when a man and a woman are combined, won't the man and woman become parents? Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao and said, after matching, we will go to the gene exchange center with another person of the opposite sex. The two of us are not allowed to see each other's faces. After that, we will continue to match and go with other people of the opposite sex. Gene Exchange Center. Chen Tao was stunned for a moment. He said, in this case, aren't humans just like livestock? Isn't this the breeding procedure when raising livestock? Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao touched the back of his head and said, well, I didn't mean to offend you. Pei Ai took a deep look at Chen Tao, and then looked away. Maybe it's what you said, and it's not wrong, but for the continuation of humankind's fire, it has to be like that. This is the end. The end, this is the end. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai, who was meditating. Indeed, in Chen Tao's world, he is omnipotent. He does not need to think too much. He can be leisurely every day and do whatever he wants. But in the world where Pei Ai lives, it is experiencing the end of the world. There is no other way. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai and said, have you been to the Gene Exchange Center? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 339. When Pei Ai heard this, she blushed and glanced at Chen Tao. It's very rude to ask like this. Chen Tao was stunned, and he said, well, sorry. Pei Ai retracted his gaze, the time for my first genetic exchange has been arranged. I think it should be soon. After this mission is over, I have to go. Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai, are you willing to go? Pei Ai said slowly, that's a mission, and the mission must be completed. There is no such thing as willingness or unwillingness. Suddenly, Pei Ai's eyes lit up slightly, and said, here, That's the mecha of Ching, the captain of my team. Chen Tao looked forward. There are two off-road vehicles over there. On the off-road vehicle is a humanoid mecha. The humanoid mecha is sitting on the off-road vehicle and looking at this side. Inside the humanoid mecha, Ching's eyes trembled as she looked at the huge monster in front of her, and her expression was full of disbelief. What is this? At this time, the giant humanoid mecha slowly squatted down and stretched out his hand. Ching could see two people standing on the palm of the giant humanoid mecha. Pei Ai and Chen Tao jumped up from the palm of the giant humanoid mecha together. Pei Ai looked at the mecha driven by Ching. Ching recovered. The mecha opened, she climbed out of the mecha cabin and landed in front of Chen Tao and Pei Ai. Chen Tao looked closely. Wow, another beauty. This is a beauty with short silver hair, she is wearing a white leather tights, which fits her attractive figure. But the silver-haired beauty looks a little cold. Captain Ching, Pei Ai said, his name is Chen Tao. He was the one who saved me by driving this giant humanoid mecha. Ching's eyes fell on Chen Tao, and she said, thank you for saving Pei Ai. Chen Tao said, you're welcome. Ching looked at the behemoth, he looked at Chen Tao, and then she looked at Chen Tao and said, thank you for saving Pei Ai. Chen Tao said, no, it's just a piece of cake. Ching nodded slightly and said, our mission has been completed. We are planning to return to the Holy Land. Do you want to go back with us? Chen Tao crossed his arms and said, well, I have been alone for a while. It's rare to see two beauties. Of course I have to go home with them. Ching looked at Chen Tao and said, okay, then come with us. As she said that, Ching sat in the off-road vehicle. She looked at Pei Ai next to her and said, Pei Ai, you drive that one. Resources in the Holy Land are in short supply, so if the car can be recycled, it will be recycled. Pei Ai nodded. Pei Ai sat in the driver's seat of the off-road vehicle next to him. She started the SUV, but just as she started, she felt a movement beside her. She turned her head and saw Chen Tao sitting in the passenger seat, looking at her. Pei Ai was slightly startled and said, what are you doing? Chen Tao crossed his arms, looked at Pei Ai and smiled, it's very uncomfortable to sit on the mecha all the time. If there is a car, of course I have to sit in it. Pei Ai blushed slightly and said, whatever you want. She retracted her gaze and drove the car. Ching couldn't help but look over here. She looked back through the rearview mirror while driving. The huge humanoid mecha behind was slowly catching up. Ching retracted her gaze. The two subs drove for about an hour. Chen Tao raised his head and looked ahead. There was a plane in front, and on this plane stood a huge metal wall, which was 20 meters high. There were traces of time on this metal wall. After a long period of wind and rain, even the extremely solid metal left traces of wear and tear. Approaching the wall, Ching operated on the operating table in front of her. She looked straight ahead and said, Captain, I'm Ching. Welcome back, a female voice sounded. As the words fell on the city wall, a huge metal plate slowly descended. When the off-road vehicle approached, the huge metal plate had already landed. The off-road vehicle drove directly onto the metal plate. The off-road vehicle stopped. Ching turned her head and looked at Chen Tao, saying, your mecha may not be able to be transported up. Chen Tao said, no door. No door. Pei Ai gave Chen Tao a definite answer. Chen Tao nodded slightly, well, it's okay, I'll just put it on standby. This wall is really tight, there is not even a door. The lifting platform made of metal plates slowly rose. It rose to be parallel to the top of the city wall. Chen Tao looked forward and found two people standing on the city wall. Standing in front was a blonde woman in an exquisite black uniform, wearing a pair of high-heeled round boots. She crossed her arms and smiled when she saw the three people. Welcome back. And Ching said, Captain. The blonde woman nodded slightly, and her eyes fell on Chen Tao next to her. And Ching said, Captain, this time Basin and Kafei died, and except for my mecha, the other 3 mechas were also damaged. With our ability, we are currently unable to recover them. Pei Ai almost died in the hands of the beasts, but fortunately he was saved. This man is called Chen Tao, and he seems to be a survivor. And Ching looked at the blonde woman. The blonde woman crossed her arms and her figure was much more amazing than Pei Ai and Ching. This ring made the tight-fitting uniform on the upper body look very high. The blonde captain smiled and said, My name is Dimancha, and I am the leader of the resource search team. Chen Tao said, My name is Chen Tao. Dimancha turned slightly sideways, standing on the 20-meter-high city wall, looking down at the huge mecha that was 10 meters high and as big as a hill. She looked at Chen Tao, This thing is not from the Holy Land, is this yours? Her eyelashes were long and narrow, her eyes moved slightly, and her big eyes looked at Chen Tao, looking particularly interesting. Chen Tao nodded slightly and said, Yes. Dimancha retracted her gaze, looked at the behemoth below, and said, It's a shocking thing. Dimancha looked at Pei Ai and said, Pei Ai, take Chen Tao down, find a place for Chen Tao to stay, and let him rest first. Pei Ai nodded slightly. She looked at Chen Tao and said, Let's go. Pei Ai walked forward, Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai's slender and tall back, and he followed. In this way, only Dimancha and Ching were left on the city wall, as well as the staff who were moving the off-road vehicle and mecha. Dimancha looked at the backs of Chen Tao and Pei Ai, watching them go away. Dimancha narrowed her eyes. Captain Ching said beside her. Dimancha nodded slightly and said, I know what you are thinking, this man's origin is completely unknown, but the giant mecha he brought has great value. If used well, it may change the fate of mankind. This matter is of great importance, and this matter must be reported to the commander. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 340. Chen Tao followed Pei Ai. From this angle, you can just take in Pei Ai's back. The tight-fitting black leather jumpsuit she wore fit her figure perfectly. Her waist was slender, and the leather fabric below was stretched gracefully by her strong and round hips. Her legs, which were tightly fitted by leather trousers, were slender and straight. She wore a pair of black cylindrical high-heeled boots, which made her already tall figure even taller. Chen Tao crossed his arms with his chest. Frankly speaking, Chen Tao is quite interested in the civilization that is going through the end of the world, but from a certain perspective, Chen Tao does not intend to get involved in the civilization. But as a man, he couldn't do it if he saw such a beautiful beauty turned into a corpse. Being soft-hearted is a disease. But there's no way, it can't be changed. Pei Ai slowed down his pace. As a result, Chen Tao naturally could no longer stay behind Pei Ai. Instead, he walked next to Pei Ai and stood shoulder to shoulder with Pei Ai. Why did she suddenly slow down? Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai, only to find that Pei Ai was looking at him. There was a blush on her cheeks under the corners of her eyes, and there was a hint of embarrassment in her eyes. Seeing this, Chen Tao was startled. He understood instantly. It was obvious that Pei Ai had discovered that he had just stared at a part that he shouldn't have looked at. Chen Tao smiled and said, You have a really good figure. Pei Ai looked away, This is the Holy Land, not outside. There are laws of the Holy Land in the Holy Land. Men and women are not allowed to be too close. If you are discovered, you will be executed. Execution, Chen Tao couldn't help but be startled. He looked at Pei Ai and said, Do you not even have the right to love someone here? Suddenly, Pei Ai's footsteps stopped. Chen Tao was startled and looked at Pei Ai. Pei Ai raised her face and looked at Chen Tao, her eyes filled with confusion. Love? What is that? Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai with confusion on his face and blinked. Someone was passing by. Pei looked away. There was a black, wide, and very cool motorcycle in front of him. Pei got on the motorcycle, put on a helmet, then looked at Chen Tao and said, "Come up. Come up." Chen Tao looked at the seat behind Pei. "This is interesting." Chen Tao stood up, sat on the seat behind Pei, and leaned close to Pei. His hands habitually wrapped around the waist of the woman in his arms. "You, what are you doing?" Pei was startled. Her face turned red, but she couldn't see because the helmet was blocking her. She said, "Sit tight and don't move your hands." Chen Tao was slightly startled, then he smiled and said, "Okay, don't move." But he still didn't leave Pei's waist. Pei blushed and said, "Let go." After hearing Pei's clear request, Chen Tao reluctantly let go of his hand. Seeing Chen Tao let go, Pei was not so excited, but his mood was still a little difficult to calm down. She started the motorcycle and it flew away quickly. "The wind is coming." Pei's heart beat faster. It has been more than 50 years since the end of the world. Brand new laws have been established in the sanctuary. Many things were previously considered to be products of the old world, including love. Love, these two words have long been abandoned. In the dictionary of the residents of the sanctuary, the word love does not exist. Therefore, Pei is a very pure warrior, and the relationship between men and women is a completely blank field for her. Other male warriors' relationships with Pei, that is, ordinary warrior relationships, are not as bold as Chen Tao's. She looked at her in various strange ways, and even dared to attack her directly. You must know that if the judges of the sanctuary saw what Chen Tao just did, he would probably be executed. Just being hugged by Chen Tao like this made Pei feel confused. There is a curved descent directly from the city wall. After entering the city wall, Chen Tao could see many houses, which were relatively simple. The people outside the house were wearing shabby clothes and were a little skinny. They seemed to have been hungry for a while. When they saw someone driving a motorcycle in, they raised their faces and looked this way. There was no light in their eyes, and some were just gray. This is the inferior area. The inferior area is on the periphery. Through the gate in front, you enter the superior area. At present, the food produced in the sanctuary is not enough for the people in the sanctuary to eat. However, there has been a drought in the sanctuary recently, and the amount of food is large. Food is already very scarce, and the food is now concentrated in the superior areas, so people in the inferior areas can only starve. However, if the food is not collected, even the superior areas will starve. Love explains. Hearing this, Chen Tao frowned. In other words, these people in front of them are now in a semi-abandoned state. If people die, these people will die first. Chen Tao looked forward and saw that there was indeed a gate and a wall ahead. The wall divided the superior area from the inferior area. There were men in uniforms guarding the gate, holding firearms. Pei drove through the gate and entered the premium area. After entering the premium area, Chen Tao felt that the environment had completely changed, and the houses here were all exquisite. Everyone is dressed exquisitely, looks natural and sunny. They are completely different from the people in the inferior areas. The motorcycle stopped slowly. Chen Tao raised his face and looked up. This was a house similar to an apartment. Pei took Chen Tao into the apartment. "This is my room. Just stand here. Don't come in." Pei stopped in front of a door, took out a card, and swiped it in front of the door while talking. Pei opened the door. Entered the room. "Don't let Chen Tao in? Then it's okay to take a look, right?" Chen Tao looked inside. Bang, the door closed. Chen Tao blinked. After a while, the door opened. Pei walked out of the room. She had something similar to a tablet in her hand, but it looked much more high-tech. She said to Chen Tao, "Come on, I'll take you to your room. Pei Ai walked forward, and Chen Tao followed. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai. Pei Ai walked while operating the things in her hand. On the screen, the 3D mode of this apartment appeared. She pulled out one of the rooms, then clicked it, and an input bar appeared. She entered Chen Tao's name in the input bar and clicked OK. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Did she want to take this thing out? It turned out that she was helping Chen Tao to register. She took Chen Tao to a room, picked up a card and swiped the door, and the door opened. Pei Ai handed the card to Chen Tao and said, "This is the room card. With it, you can use this room. I have registered this room for you, and you can live here." Chen Tao walked in and looked at the room. Although the room was simple, it was a bit narrow for Chen Tao, who was used to living in a big house. This room was probably the same as Chen Tao's ordinary single dormitory. The resources of the Holy Land were limited, including space resources. Even for residents of the superior area, the rooms they could live in were like this. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai behind him, and he smiled and said, "Come in and sit down and chat." A man invited a woman to chat in a room. As a woman, it was obviously unlikely to agree. Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao. She didn't say anything. She went into the room by herself, and closed the bedroom door with her backhand. Looking at this, Chen Tao was stunned. Chen Tao originally wanted to tease Pei Ai, but unexpectedly, Pei Ai actually came in and closed the door. What does that mean?